But as I recall, when I discovered your guys' show, you've been doing it for a while, but you decided to send it to iTunes, a little bit later because there was a fair amount of episodes available when I first checked it out. So what was the reason for that delay?
Maybe not knowing what we were doing.
Technical difficulties.
There's that. There's the fact that we really released the first season just to like friends and family almost. Like we wanted to see kind of what would happen organically in that first season if we just kind of, we didn't put it on any of the big syndication sort of networks, and we didn't put it on any of the sort of platforms. I mean, we did okay, but yeah, season 2 was when we decided, okay, we know how to do iTunes and Stitcher now. We'll go through with it. We'll see what happens. And I think, to a certain extent, we had read some sort of, like tips on how to get your podcast going. And they always said have a good bank of content before you go on to like an iTunes platform. And that seemed to be, I think it was the right choice for us, to be honest.
And it created this, we always think that there's this weird synergy. Mike and I are both pattern recognizers. We think there's this weird synergy between the fortunes of our podcast and the fortunes of WKRP. So in the first season of WKRP, they don't really know what they're doing. There's some brilliance there, but it's also the wheels are kind of coming off at any given moment. And then the second season of WKRP was when they got their best time slot. They were 9:30 on Tuesdays right after MASH. And that was their best ratings ever. And our second season is when we were in New and Noteworthy and getting all the good real estate on iTunes. And then, season 3 and 4 of WKRP, people loved it, but the network never quite knew what to do with it. And they just kept bumping it around town to town, up and down the dial, as they say. And it had like 20 time slots in its 4-year run or something. Now, we don't have that problem, but we joke about that. If our downloads are not as good as we maybe wish they would be, actually, they're doing just fine. Every single person who listens, I figure, is like, it's a treat that anyone would want to listen. So I'm not concerned about that. But we do joke that like, oh, well, it's just like WKRP. We're...
Yeah, and it's also
and there was also sort of like the subject matter of season 3 gets a little more serious, gets a little darker. They start doing more issue episodes. They start being a little more dramatic. And, basically when we were right smack dab in the middle of season 3, the wheels came off American democracy. And then we were pretty much saying to ourselves, oh my God, did we cause this kind of weird synergistic curse between our show and reality? Is this like The Ring or something like that? If you listen to the podcast in 8 days, does the Trump get elected president? That kind of thing. So we've had some moments where we've been like, maybe we shouldn't be taking these correspondences too seriously.
Well, speaking of politics, and you guys mentioned backgrounds as historians, interestingly, as I said, it went from 78 to 82. So it had one foot in the Jimmy Carter era and it had one foot in Reagan. And they self-reference both those things. Every once in a while, Carter will be mentioned. Ray, you mentioned the Russian one. Reagan and the issue about not having the current president as a photo on the wall.
I never sent him a Carter.
Never sent me a Carter. Yeah, exactly.
There's politics in the show, and like you say, that those years, 78 to 82, end up being really interesting years. A lot of water under the bridge between 78 and 82, and a big sea change in. Definitely between Carter and Reagan, but just in America in general. And so many things, maybe we'd see this if we looked at any period of history, but certainly every time we look at it, Mike and I find things that resonate or reflect on what's going on in America today.
And I want to mention Mike's show notes because for people who listen to the show and want a little bit extra, seems like you put just as much effort into that as doing the show.
I love doing them. I mean, there's weeks where I'm kind of like, well, geez, do I have 1,500 words in me? Can I put together a list of things? But like, there are so many things that we only are able to barely touch on, both having to do with the show itself and the history around the show. So it really helps me kind of like feel like I've given the listeners like a complete sort of view of the things we've talked about that week. And, again, sometimes there's just as simple as Wikipedia links, but, sometimes when we're doing research to prep for the show, we'll find amazing stuff that we didn't know about. I mean, like the research that we do, it may not be like super detailed, but we often find things that whether it's media or music or something along those lines that we just had never heard of before. And it's just a treat to like be able to like talk about it briefly on the show and then share it in more detail in the notes.
You know, you guys have already mentioned you'll put in a little clip from The Simpsons that is relevant to the episode. And, you know, I get almost all of them. I guess I'm in tune with you guys in terms of I recognize the sources. But, you know, SCTV, again, because of my age, I saw all that stuff first run, love it. I'm sure that being Canadian, you know, Rob is well versed in this. But apparently the episode lengths for SCTV were different in the U.S. and Canada. In Canada, they had like a little leftover time they needed to fill, presumably because there were fewer commercial breaks or what have you. So, you know, so the show, SCTV, was asked to create some, quote, Canadian content, unquote, to fill that time, to which SCTV sarcastically responded, what do you mean Canadian content? You want us to put on toques and fry up back bacon and drink beer? And the network's like, yeah, something like that. You know, so that's how the Great White North with Bob and Doug McKenzie was born. You know, they would just improvise on some random topic for whatever the 2 or 3 minutes they needed to flesh out the Canadian version of the show. And of course, the punchline is, you know, Bob and Doug became a huge success. They were wildly popular.
Big breakout characters.
Exactly.
Yes.
Much to the dismay of some of the other cast members, you know, because, you know, this was a sarcastic joke. This was like, oh, here's our hey, good day, hey, we're Canadians for 2 or 3 minutes. It was supposed to be funny. So I think you guys know where I'm going with this. There's an episode of WKRP which was also born as sarcasm and which also blew up into a huge success. We're talking about Fish Story.
Yes.
So I'll pass it over to whoever wants to tell listeners about Fish Story.
This is a great story. I'm going to let Rob tell it. It's really good.
Yeah, this is one of the all-time great episodes. I mean, the episode that everybody knows of WKRP, if they don't really watch WKRP, is the turkey episode, the Thanksgiving episode with the turkeys.
Right.
But which is great. But for my money, one of the most laugh out loud funny episodes is the Fish Story, and it aired at the end of the first season, and you know, people always have these stories of the network sending notes to the creative people and the network, you know, interfering with the creative process and tampering and you know, the suits don't know what they're talking about. And basically the network was complaining to Hugh Wilson, the creator of WKRP, that the show wasn't funny enough. And, you know, they had different visions of what the show was supposed to be. Hugh Wilson had a little bit, you know, he wanted to be a little bit more intellectual. He wanted it to be on at 9:30. The network really wanted a zany show that would attract kids. They said, give us something more like Laverne and Shirley. Give us broader. Give us, and Hugh Wilson got so frustrated with this, and he said, you just want it to be dumber. And so he canvassed all the writers and said, what's the most obvious hacky joke you can think of? Right. And they took everything they could think of and they put it all in one episode. A guy in a fish suit trying to get into a pay toilet and people getting drunk on the air. And they put it all into one episode. And damned if it wasn't like a beloved, one of their funniest episodes ever. And sort of like, I don't know, like who showed who in that case, because it is, it's a classic.
Yeah, it's riddled with cliches. I mean, it's riddled with cliches. Now, as a guy who watched it and didn't know any about this passing the network notes, you know, the first thing I have to say is, you know, the WKRP carp, you know, that was the idea of the fish concert. It's like, well, you know, WPIG has a pig, so we're WKRP, so we need a carp. One thing I thought about before I even watched the show when I heard the title, KRP also spells crap.
Yeah, and I think that was intentional on the part of the writers. They had tested a bunch of silly call letters, I think, and this was the only one that wasn't like taken by a station somewhere in the country already. Right. But yeah, I think that was intentional. But the carp fits so well because, of course, the big guy Arthur Carlson loves to fish, and the fish costume itself we talk about in the episode is just so detailed. It's got like multiple fins and really, really well rendered scales. And it's just this really weird looking fish costume.
This is why you can appreciate things on different levels. Because at the time, to me, it was just another episode. Oh, they're being kind of silly with this one. But as we'll talk about in a minute, that show took some very serious and dark turns. But, you know, towards the end of that, talk about the pie fight cliche. I'm going to throw a bucket of paint at you. Oh, you stepped aside and I hit somebody else. But dude, that was like old in the Keystone Cops days. But now once you know the backstory and what was going on, you go, oh, okay, this was written in anger. This is a guy going, oh, you want a dumbass Laverne and Shirley sitcom? I got a guy in a fish suit. I got, the reporter who comes by that day and documents everything that's going wrong. Oh, dear me, don't let the reporter see this. And all that kind of stuff.
They even have a lazy painter in the lobby.
My
God,
yeah.
like talk about a comedy cliche.
Oh yeah, Cheers has done that one too. But the thing I didn't realize, I've listened to every podcast you guys have done, and I've seen every episode of WKRP. I actually went back and reviewed the fish story a day or two ago in preparation for this, and I did not, really realize that the thing about the reflexes and the drinking was on this particular episode. Because to me, that's a little bit, Venus kind of acting drunk is kind of the cliche, but it's really clever what they did in that this highway patrolman comes in. We're going to teach all you rock and roll fans that, if you have a drink or two, you still think you're in control, but you're really not. And so, it's all with the best intentions. And Johnny Fever, whether you guys can tell me if you think he's just messing with the guy or if this is true, the more he drinks, the faster his reflexes get and the better he does on the test. And it drives the guy crazy. He goes, when you're sober, you have the reflexes of a guy who's had 6 vodka martinis. And
he just gets faster and faster and faster. And of course, Venus is getting drunker and drunker, which just makes it funnier that Johnny, who is so sort of, zoned out at the best of times, has the reflexes of a cat after he's been drinking all afternoon. I never thought he was faking it. I always thought that there was something. This is just like part of Johnny's, biochemistry. Is that he's actually is getting faster.
His normal state is kind of buzzed. The bottom line is, in my opinion, that little bit is elevated above. If they intended that to be goofy, in my opinion, that's like comedy gold. And speaking of which, the moral to this story, Bob and Doug McKenzie, the fish story, intentional sarcasm can equate to comedy gold. Another thing I wanted to ask you guys about, I'm wondering if you ever surprise yourselves with some of these revelations, because what comes to mind to me is the analogy you guys made of the Fisher King.
Yes.
Well, this was our sort of put up or shut up moment for the podcast. We were doing the Turkeys Away episode, as Rob said, probably the most famous episode of WKRP.
And it's really early in the show. It's only like the 8th episode of WKRP, which meant that it's only the 4th episode of our podcast. We do 2 episodes per podcast. Yeah. So we knew we had to deal with it right off the bat.
Yeah, and you can say a lot about a episode that's become like a cultural touchstone, or you can go completely off the map and do what we did and just sort of free associate on this idea of, okay, small town radio station has a disastrous promotional event, which they toss a bunch of live turkeys out of a helicopter. Okay, well, let's break that down a little bit. What do we know about the turkey? Well, we know the turkey was going to be the symbol of America, according to Benjamin Franklin. He thought it was a more humble beast than the bald eagle. And we kind of spun it off into this whole sort of conspiratorial, occult kind of correspondence between Arthur Carlson being the Fisher King of legend and mass sacrifices of turkeys at Thanksgiving and this whole occult America thing that I think both Rob and I are really into. We had fun with it. And it was kind of like this moment where, again, the folks who were listening were our friends. They knew we loved this kind of stuff. So it was not a surprise to them. But the few folks who had come across us were like, wow, this is interesting.
So that episode is kind of like, it's almost like Mike and I doing a parody of ourselves because, it's certainly we are, we can be accused of overthinking a silly old sitcom from 35 years ago and, guilty as charged. So we sort of did this episode where we went way overboard. We came up with all this this massive occult conspiracy where, in fact, this is sort of a secret magical working by Hugh Wilson to heal the United States. And then, almost like making the name of the podcast something that nobody can remember, we made sure that the episode, probably the episode that more people are going to listen to than anything else, because if you're going to listen to one episode of WKRP podcast, maybe you're going to download the turkey one. We made sure that was the one filled with the most arcane bullshit. And so, again, we did. I don't know. It's not like we intend to chase people away, but just we don't begin from the point of view of how can we maximize shareholder value.
No, if on one extreme you have overthinking it and the other one you have underthinking it, always go with overthinking it. And I would tell you, Paul is dead. Paul McCartney is dead. The clues were there if you wanted to see him, even though it wasn't true. Likewise, the Fisher King, Well, the very first time you see Arthur Carlson, isn't he holding a fishing pole? I mean, you guys,
Sure is.
you guys had all your Paul is dead clues in there. I thought it was pretty cool. Well, for me to go back and revisit the show, honestly, I watched it back in the day. I might have caught it here and there, but I hadn't really gone back and watched episode by episode. So without doing that or hearing your show, if somebody would have just said WKRP, like Family Feud, free association, top 100 answers of the so obviously the turkeys, I think, comes to everybody's mind first. The musical ones, really for me, there are, I think, 3. Pink Floyd Dogs, Hot Blooded, and also Venus with After the Love Is Gone by Earth, Wind and Fire.
That is my jam. Yes,
yeah.
That it's not just that it's a great song and it's just really well chosen for the period and everything, but it's used so well in that episode where Bailey is kind of feeling sad because Johnny has stood her up for this date, and she's just wistfully kind of hanging around the station after all the lights are out, and she's listening to this song that Venus is playing in the booth, and it's just so well done. And I mean, I think that's probably one of my top musical moments of the show too.
There again, it's the authenticity. They didn't do some sound alike, or they didn't have the show's composer write a song. They busted out Earth, Wind, and Fire, and it was. I think of that moment when I hear that song just generally. But there's all the little random things. Like I remember Mr. Carlson putting cocaine on his feet.
Yeah,
I remember
Peruvian foot powder. I'm lucky on my foot.
I remember Les stepping outside of his hog reports, trying to do the sports and saying Chai Chai Rodriguez instead of Chichi Rodriguez. All those little things. The Impossible Song medley. The contest. We're going to make this so hard nobody can do it. Without even going back and revisiting the show, I remember all that. But for me, the main thing I remember about the turkeys thing, because there again, Thanksgiving '78, I watched that. I was the target. My dad, who would have been 43 at the time. Now, I'm watching this thing. I'm thinking, oh, Johnny Fever's pretty cool. My dad, I'm sure, identified with Mr. Carlson because the generation gap. My dad was the guy.
Yeah.
And I just remember, as God is my witness, I thought turkeys could fly. And my dad just laughing his ass off at that. And, just thinking it was so hilarious. And the whole episode and the idea that there was one of those things he and I could sort of appreciate on different levels. So I remember my dad, when I see that episode, being there when I first saw it. And he's kind of my Mr. Carlson in a way, I would say.
That's great.
Well, of course, those are hilarious moments. But, as we mentioned, another thing that I hadn't really thought of till I went through this procedure with you guys in your show is just how often that show would take a pretty serious turn. There's Venus, a.k.a. Gordon Sims, Vietnam War deserter. The trampling of fans at the Who concert. A lot of tense scenes with Arthur's mother. Speaking of another generation, who's the station owner. The laugh track goes off and they play it serious. And so there, when I think of Venus and Gordon, how are they going to take that character, Venus Flytrap? They figured, well, obviously that's not his real name. Let's do a little story about maybe what his real name is. And I'm guessing maybe that was the way in.
Yeah, I think you're right that this was still... So that episode would have aired in 78, 79. Yeah. And, that was still a live wire. That was still a third rail, difficult to touch. But they handled it really, really smartly and really well. Partly that was Hugh Wilson, the show creator, paying off a promise to Tim Reed, who played Venus, is that when he read the pilot, Tim Reed said, I don't want to play another pimp, superfly, stereotypical black man. And Hugh Wilson said, no, don't worry. We'll give you more to do. We'll deepen this character. We'll give you more to do. And the season went on, and Wilson had this idea, but the network wasn't crazy about it. And Tim Reed was like, when are you going to give me more to do you promised? And this was him paying off that promise. And boy, and Tim Reed takes it over. Like, the last 10 minutes of that show, as you say, the laugh track drops right out. And it's heavy and it's serious, but it completely lands. It's not like you don't cringe and think, oh my God, this is awful.
You believe it.
It's really, believe it. Yeah.
I think back on that scene now, Tim Reed kind of flubs a couple of lines, just kind of has to say them twice. And there's a real emotion in his voice. I mean, he wasn't a veteran, obviously, but again, how intense must that have been to do? You've been doing the sitcom for almost a complete season. You haven't had that opportunity to showcase your acting talent. And all of a sudden you're being thrown into this very, very emotionally intense topic. And he nailed it. And you could tell that the emotion was there. It was very present. It was up front. And I mean, I think it's one of the show's finest moments. I think it's well worth watching today because it doesn't flinch from the realities of some of the really horrible stuff that went on over there.
Oh man, I don't believe this.
Come on, we're here now.
Okay. Look, when they come in, tell them Gordon Sims just left, okay?
No, wait a minute. Who's Gordon Sims?
Never mind.
Yeah, let's just calm down. I mean, they're going to be fair with us.
Mr. Carlson, you live in a dream world.
Gentlemen, I'm Major Edmund Hunter. I'll be the investigating officer in this case.
Hi, I'm Gordon Sims.
Venus, that's not going to work.
Sit down, gentlemen. Now, Mr. Sims.
Yeah, look, he's not Sims. His name is Venus Flytrap.
Then you're Sims. How many years have you been hiding?
I'm Gordon Sims. That's my real name.
Yeah?
Major, what's going to happen to me?
Any number of things, Mr. Sims.
Well, they're not going to shoot him, are they?
We don't do that anymore.
See? Now, you know what this man did was wrong. It was very wrong. But the way I see it, Major, that...
Mr. Sims, I've gone over the Army's report. Now I'll need your side of the story.
Well, I hated the war, so I left.
Come on, Sims.
No, that's it. You were in Vietnam.
I was. In Saigon.
Well, I didn't get there much. I was in Coochie, Chiria, Bong Song. Kept us black folks pretty close to the action.
Venus, the man is trying to help you.
Yeah. Well. Okay. Here's my story.
Now, this is a story. You write this down.
Who is this guy?
My father.
The show was not filmed in Cincinnati, but it was set in Cincinnati. And you had this real event. The Who had a concert. Yeah. A bunch of people were killed at the concert, and they were the type of people who would be watching WKRP. I don't know if it was the cast or the writer said, we have to comment on this. We can't be a rock and roll radio station set in Cincinnati and not comment on this event. And there was another one. Not that they went out to do it, it sort of fell in their lap. If it would have happened in Minneapolis, maybe they would have commented on it from afar, but it was in their hometown. So, what were your feelings about that one?
Yeah, I mean, that episode... I think that episode really, I mean, again, there was another situation where the network was a little cagey about it. They weren't sure if they would be able to touch on it with the right sensitivity. I mean, again, I think they did a really good job with it. The first half of the episode is straight comedy, and then the second half is straight drama, And, from what we read and kind of the sort of media notices afterwards, the people of Cincinnati really responded well to it. And it was one of those situations where it really helped cement the show's relationship with that community. Again, there's no real good way to go about talking about this. The idea was that the episode would be kind of it would kind of advocate for the banning of this festival seating, this general admission seating. And, eventually, I think a couple months later, the Cincinnati City Council actually did ban it.
The episode was actually held up until they could get a copy to the Cincinnati affiliate was balking and saying, we can't show this. And so I don't know how you sent video quickly from one place to another in 1980, but they got the affiliate a copy of the episode. And of course, when they saw it, they were all like, oh, this is terrific. You handled this really well. We thought you were just going to make jokes. When people saw it, everyone understood, yeah, their heart is in the right place.
Or if not make jokes, maybe try and exploit the connection between the city and the show. Say, just, we can maybe get some attention because, it wasn't like that. It was very respectful. But let's lighten things up. Everybody who's seen Gilligan's Island knows you have the Ginger Marianne debate. WKRP has a similar iconic matchup. They have Jennifer or Bailey. Now, I don't know about your guys' experience, but I find that Marianne and Bailey nearly always win. Apparently guys prefer the approachable...
Shocker. It's a shocker.
Apparently guys prefer the approachable cute girl to the glamorous trophy. But the debate does occur, and for the female listeners, I apologize for us, getting all sexist here, but it's something we have to comment on. It's pop culture. Yeah. It's pop culture, but there is a direct parallel because I guess maybe Jennifer and Bailey was the new Ginger Marianne.
Sure. Yeah, they are archetypal. So you almost can't avoid having the conversation. Mike and I laugh about this because, yeah, of course, we both love Bailey. Jan Smithers is gorgeous, and we both love Bailey. But to describe it as the Bailey-Jennifer debate means that you've ever found anyone anywhere who picked Jennifer, and that has not been our experience. The funny thing about the debate is that we keep running into dudes who say, you know what? I always thought Bailey was hotter. Like they are like Columbus discovering America. like you don't get, yeah, she's gorgeous. You don't get any points for like looking at your television set and seeing that Jan Smithers is smoking. Like that's just it's not a secret.
And I think we've gained a huge appreciation for Jennifer over the course of doing this podcast. And again, like at that time period, like Lonnie Anderson herself was very conscious of the fact there were shows like Charlie's Angels and Three's Company on that were derisively called jiggle shows and sort of, objectifying the lead, the female leads in those shows. What happened with Jennifer over the course of these, even just over the course of the first season, was you realize that the whole blonde receptionist, maybe being oblivious thing is a complete act, and Jennifer is hyper competent, and she keeps the station running, and she's also the heart of the station, and she's kind of the heart of the entire WKRP family. And so there's this depth that's given to this character that really could have been a very easy stereotype. And I think a lot of that was down to Lonnie Anderson and the fact that she was a very sort of smart and very funny. Like I didn't remember her being this funny, but as we've rewatched the show, her comic timing is excellent. She just does great line reads. And again, like the moment you underestimate the character, boom, she comes out and completely takes you by surprise. And so I think as far as like underrated sort of performances on the show, Lonnie is well up there.
It sounds funny to say that since everyone knows Lonnie Anderson was a star and
right.
All the guys had her poster and everything. But
yeah.
we rewatching it, we really did discover, oh, she's really funny. And Jan Smithers is funny too, but she is perhaps thrown in the deep end as a performer and grows into the part as the show goes on. Whereas Lonnie Anderson is a professional comedian right up there with Gordon Jump, Frank Bonner, Howard Hessman.
Yeah. Right, and we've been discussing these characters just sort of under the assumption everybody knows what we're talking about. But you said earlier you don't have a Rob. You said you don't have a quote unquote favorite. I wouldn't ask you to pick a favorite or even necessarily pick a least favorite. To me, though, for me personally, there are sort of two tiers. For me, top tier, Arthur Carlson for sure. Gordon Jump, love him.
Yeah.
Howard Hesseman, Johnny Fever, love him. Tim Reed, love him. Okay. Frank Bonner, Herb, love him. Okay.
Are you going to put everyone in one tier and then Andy in the bottom tier?
No. I would say sort of skirting both of them would be Bailey. I like Jan Smithers. I like Bailey, but the character was maybe a little underused. Yeah. So for me, Les Nessman, Jennifer Marlowe, and certainly Andy Travis, I like, but not as much. And there are specific reasons. My biggest problem with Andy Travis, and there again, it's very important to say, draw a distinction between Gary Sandy and the character he plays. Draw a distinction between Lonnie Anderson and the character she plays. Andy Travis at times was just so good old boy, and so his actual portrayal of the character kind of took me out of it sometimes. I didn't think a guy would really act that way.
Well, the one thing, the similarity between Jennifer and Andy is that we have found that they really got funnier when they're more flustered because they're the coolest people, right? Like they're beautiful, they're like collected, calm, and cool. But like when you throw them into situations where they have to kind of manage the chaos that's going on at the station, all of a sudden they shine. They become people who are cool, who are being flustered. And all of a sudden you've got actual comedy going on there instead of sort of just people looking awesome and being great, I
would put it this way. When Andy Travis is the butt of the joke, it's much better. When he's the butt of the joke. And then in terms of Jennifer, when her persona is peeled back, she's better. And, because I would say when you first see Lonnie Anderson with that immovable hair, It does not act like hair. It acts like a dark helmet. It doesn't move. It's got like probably 3 cans of hairspray on it. It's not really necessarily a natural color. It kind of she sort of reads as sort of fake and superficial, and then on first glance, okay, as opposed to your more naturalistic Bailey, let's say. But what you find is, and we'll get into some of the supporting characters in a minute, when an old boyfriend comes back, she's from West Virginia. Are you kidding me? She's a person who's reinvented herself. She's a person who is who has consciously changed her image and her persona and stuff. And when the mask comes off and you see her in a little bit, and as the characters and the actors even get, I think both those characters, Andy Travis and Jennifer Marlowe, definitely benefit from the show evolving. Same with Tim Reed and everything. You like them more as time goes by. And there's a lot of really funny stuff that Gary Sandy does, and there's a lot of sort of serious stuff that he delivers well. To me, he just has more of those moments where I go, nah, this is a guy acting on a show. And he will tell you himself, he kind of felt a little out of his element and now classed by people like Frank Bonner. He felt a little bit more, I won't say cookie cutter, but, maybe there again, he was brought in as the sort of beefcake character. But just to finish off with my sort of second tier, which would be Les Nessman, there again, a little bit too kooky, like, oh, I have imaginary walls, and then it gets a little bit too nutty. So I would say he's sort of the least sort of believable character on a certain level, but certainly used to great effect, soft-spoken, and he's another guy who's maybe a little bit more formal and sort of conservative and everything. So obviously, people who've never seen the show at all, they introduce the characters very effectively, and you've probably picked up little bits we've said. But as I just alluded to, when they bring in an old girlfriend for Andy Travis back, you see a different side of him. If they bring in an old boyfriend for Jennifer back, which was Hoyt Axton, you see a different side of her. Johnny had a daughter, So, and I'm guessing when they recorded or when they shot and wrote season 1, they maybe that was on the drawing board, maybe it wasn't. So again, for the performer Howard Hesseman, they go, oh well, we get to keep seeing different sides of these characters as the seasons go on, because they'll introduce things like this.
I think one of the episodes that really shone for me that I hadn't thought about since I was a little kid was the one where Herb's dad, played by Burt Parks, comes back. And Burt Parks is doing a very sort of like he's emulating sort of the character that Frank Bonner has kind of established over the 2 seasons. But it added a lot. I mean, it was a very dramatic episode again, and it added a lot of depth to that Herb character that I think we really went into very great detail in that episode. It's probably one of my favorite episodes of our podcast, is where we just go deep into Herb and all of his masculine anxieties and how he was raised and what his dad did to him and how he treats women. And it was just a fascinating, again, in the 70s, you had sitcoms that went deep into the characters like psyches in a way that they didn't do in the 60s and the 50s at all, and sort of made them characters into like really complex human beings with actual histories and family histories and everything else that make them the people that they are. And WKRP is probably one of the best examples of that from that. I mean, the 70s to me is sort of the golden age of the American sitcom as far as being kind of simultaneously realistic and funny and tackling real issues, but also kind of keeping things light enough to be entertaining.
I can imagine somebody who knows Herb on the show meeting his dad, hanging out with his dad for a few minutes and turning to Herb and going, this explains a lot. You just gain so much insight into Herb's entire trip when you see who his role model was.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and this happens with all the characters this is pretty standard on television, but WKRP does it really well that the show is not serialized in the way of a 21st century TV show where, you have to watch it in order, and what happens in episode 2 affects what happens in episode 9 and then shapes what happens in episode 12. But as you go along, what they do is they fill in the backstory of the characters, and everybody gets richer, deeper, more three-dimensional, while still staying funny. That's the line you have to walk. And so they all get, pretty much every character gets, 1 or 2 good deepening character episodes per season. And so by the time you get to season 4, you feel like you know these people.
And you want to hang out with them, for sure.
You do, yeah.